A month ago, I started noticing something strange was going on with my wife. We had been together for 5 years, and in that time I had learned every habit, every little detail of her behavior. But in the last few weeks, everything had gone wrong. She had become irritable, as if something was constantly bothering her. Ordinary conversations turned into outbursts of aggression, and our disagreements turned into heated arguments, the kind that the neighbors probably heard. I could have written it off as stress or fatigue, but something about her behavior was nagging at me. My job had always been stressful. I ran a small business that had kept me afloat for the past 2 years. Work ate up most of my time, and sometimes it seemed to me that I was too caught up in business to understand her changes. It was easier that way, but something inside told me that it was not just the stress of work or fatigue. Suspicions began to smolder. I didn't know how to approach the topic, and an open confrontation could only make the situation worse. So I decided to do something different. On the third day after another argument, I didn't think twice about calling a private detective whose contacts I found online. The website said that they professionally solve any issues. It seemed like just what I needed. The detective met me in a coffee shop near my office. He was about 45 years old, with faded eyes and a hoarse voice, clearly a former police officer. I explained the gist of the matter to him, and he quickly came up with a plan. "We need to install a wiretap in her car," he said, leafing through his notebook. "This will give us a complete picture of her movements and conversations. In addition, I will install cameras in the office. If something happens there, we will know about it first." At first, the idea seemed too radical to me, but I agreed. After all, this was the only way to find out the truth. 2 days later, the detective installed the equipment. He had done it so cleverly that even I was amazed. His team had broken into my wife's car and installed a microphone within minutes. Then they did the same in her office. Everything went smoothly, and I waited for the results with bated breath. For the first few days, nothing suspicious happened. I began to think that maybe I had made a mistake, maybe it was just a temporary problem in the relationship. But then, on the 4th day, when I turned on the recording from her car, everything changed. My wife's voice was muffled, but I clearly heard her words. "I missed you so much. I can't wait any longer. Let's meet on Friday." My heart sank. Her interlocutor, a man whose voice I didn't recognize, responded with something like, "Finally," and they agreed to meet at a bar not far from her office. I froze. There were too many thoughts in my head, but none of them lingered. It was like a nightmare from which I could not wake up. I listened on, gritting my teeth. As the conversation continued, it became clear that this was not the first time they had met. They discussed how they had already had a few quickies in a car near the office, and now they were planning to have a real time at a hotel. My mind was clouded. I couldn't believe that this was actually happening. She had lied to me, saying that she was having a girls' night out with her friends on Saturday, when in reality, she was planning to spend the night with this man. I felt something inside me snap, but I wasted no time. The first thing I did was find his wife. The detective had been very helpful with that too. I got her number, and despite my internal struggle, I called her. She was stunned by my call, but after I laid it all out, she agreed to meet. We met in a small coffee shop, similar to the one where I had met the detective. I told her everything I had learned. We sat across the table from each other, two complete strangers who had been bound together by the betrayal of our other halves. Her reaction was predictable, tears, hysteria. But I remained cool. I explained that if she wanted proof, she would have to come with me on Saturday. The plan was simple. We would rent a car and follow them. She agreed. Friday came. We parked near the bar and waited. My nerves were on edge. My patience was running out with each passing minute. But finally the bar door opened and my wife came out. Behind her, the same man I had never seen before. They got into her car, the car I bought her for our anniversary. I looked at my companion. She was shaking all over, but she held on. They drove towards a cheap hotel near the airport. I motioned for her to follow them. We stopped at the entrance to the hotel, waiting a few minutes. My heart was pounding. I pulled myself together and got out of the car. It was time to act. We were sitting in a rental car on the side of the road in front of the hotel. I don't remember how the last few hours had passed. Everything had merged into one endless stream of anticipation and tension. It was boiling inside, Every second seemed like an eternity. The light from the street lamp cast eerie shadows on the windshield, as if the night itself was peering into the car, teasing us with this dark moment. There, his lover's wife said, nervously fiddling with her fingers. Her eyes were filled with tears, but there was no longer fear in them, only cold determination. I don't believe it. I can't believe it. I couldn't believe it either. My wife, the woman I'd lived with for so many years, was now in a cheap room with another man. But it hadn't been proven yet. We had to act, but I couldn't afford to give in to emotion. I pulled myself together. Wait a little longer, I told her, checking my phone. I wanted to make sure we caught them at their most vulnerable moment. No doubts. No loopholes. 5 minutes passed. We sat in silence, only occasionally exchanging brief glances. The noise of cars could be heard in the distance, and I thought how strange it was that for the rest of the world this night was as ordinary as any other. People were driving about their business, returning home, going to bed, and our lives were falling apart. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I opened the car door and nodded to my companion. We stepped out, and the cold air of the winter evening hit our faces, chilling us to the bone. I zipped up my jacket and stepped toward the hotel entrance. My heart was pounding. The blood was pounding in my ears. I knew the moment was near, and it gave me strength. We approached the door of the room. I raised my hand, ready to knock. My hand hung in the air for what seemed like an eternity. I looked back at my companion. She looked like she was ready for anything but this. But I had no choice. I knocked. Silence. A second passed. 2. I hit the door harder. This time, after a few moments, I heard footsteps inside. The door opened slightly, and a man stood before me, wearing only a towel, barely covering him. His eyes widened as he recognized me. "Who?" he began, but I didn't let him finish. "Hi, I'm A's husband," I said, clenching my fists. "I think you know what I mean." Before he could answer, my fist crashed into his face. The blow was precise and strong. He fell back, the towel sliding to the floor. I stepped inside, stepping over his body, lying on the floor. The man groaned, trying to come to his senses, but I no longer cared. My wife was sitting on the bed, shaking all over. She pressed her hands to her face, her eyes darting around the room, not knowing where to hide from my gaze. I picked up her clothes from the floor and threw them in her face. "Get dressed," I said coldly, not giving her time to justify herself or say anything. She tried to say something, but I had already turned to her lover. Grabbing him by the collar, I jerked him out of the room like a bag of garbage, dragging him along the hotel corridor. He tried to resist, but all his resistance was in vain. Having brought him to the exit door, I pushed him into the deep snow that covered the ground. He fell face down, and after him, like a shadow, his wife jumped out. In that same second, she pounced on him like an enraged lioness, punching and kicking him, screaming something incoherent. He did not resist. Apparently, he finally realized what a hole he had fallen into. I stood nearby, watching this scene, and felt a strange satisfaction. This was what we had come here for. We had done everything we had planned. Entering the room again, I approached my wife. She was still sitting on the bed, only half dressed, her hands shaking, and her eyes shining with fear. "You weren't supposed to know this," she muttered, her voice weak and trembling. Those words set something on fire inside me. Not conscience, not regret, anger. The anger I had been holding in for so long. Without a word, I grabbed her hand and pulled her out of the room, not giving her time to resist. We went down the stairs, me literally dragging her along with me, as if she were a doll and not the woman I once loved. At the exit, I stopped, took out my phone, and turned on the recording. She looked at me in horror as I started filming her, standing in her robe in the cold night air. "Speak," I said. She was silent. Her lips were trembling, but she could not utter a word. I brought the phone closer to her face. "Speak," I screamed, not holding back my anger. She was trembling, but after a few seconds she said, I cheated on you several times." I turned off the recording without saying another word. I dialed her father's number. She realized what I was about to do and screamed, trying to break free from my hands. "No, please no." But I already had the phone to my ear, hearing his sleepy voice on the other end of the line. "It's me," I said. "Your daughter cheated on me. We just caught her red-handed." There was silence on the line for a few moments. "Disgusting," her father finally said and hung up. My wife collapsed to the ground, sobbing as if her whole life had collapsed in that moment. I looked down at her and felt nothing. Absolutely nothing. Her clothes were lying next to her. I picked them up and threw them at her. "Get dressed. There's nothing more for you to do here." Then I called a cab. She got dressed, but she still didn't look up. We stood in the cold for a few more minutes until the car arrived. I put her in the cab, told the driver to take her to her sister's, and never looked back. She drove away. A few days after I sent my wife to her sister, I received a strange call on my phone. It was an unknown number, and I almost hung up, but something made me answer it. "Hello," said the voice on the other end of the line. "This is a call from a mental hospital. Your wife has been hospitalized. We need to discuss her condition with you." I dropped the phone from my hands. For a few seconds, I just stood there, motionless, trying to process what I had just heard. A mental hospital? Hospitalization? I didn't know what to say, but after a few moments I picked up the phone and barely held it in my hands. "What happened to her?" "She had a severe nervous breakdown. We need you to come to the meeting as soon as possible." I agreed. After ending the call, I ran my hand over my face and took a few deep breaths. As if all this wasn't enough, now I would have to deal with the consequences of what had happened. I tried to push away the thoughts that it was all my fault, but they kept coming back. Was I responsible for her condition? When I arrived at the hospital, the atmosphere inside was oppressive. White walls, dim lighting, and an uneasy silence everywhere. I was shown to the doctor's office, where I was met by an elderly man with glasses, apparently a psychiatrist. He quickly got down to business. "Your wife has been in the hospital with us for several days. She has had a serious emotional crisis since the incident you described. She has partially lost touch with reality." He paused, as if trying to find the right words, but then continued. "We believe that this crisis is caused by the deep trauma caused by your breakup." I listened, feeling a wave of indignation rising inside me, but outwardly remained calm. The doctor continued. "She's in a very fragile state right now. We need you to help her stabilize." The doctor's words barely reached my consciousness. I didn't know how to react to all this. My wife had deceived me, betrayed me, and now she was in a mental hospital. It was so absurd that for a moment I thought this wasn't happening to me. But it was reality. "We can start with a short meeting with her," the doctor said, "to see how she reacts to your presence. Maybe it will help her recover." I didn't want that. I wasn't ready for the meeting, but there was no other way. The doctor stood up, motioning for me to follow him, and we walked down a long corridor. The door to my wife's room was closed. The doctor opened it and let me in. She was sitting on the bed, her eyes empty, as if all her emotions had burned out. It took me a moment to recognize her as the woman who had argued with me in the kitchen or smiled at me across the table a few weeks ago. She was pale, drawn, and seemed to have lost a few pounds. She used to have a toned, graceful figure. She used to be a figure skater, but now she looked like her life had been thrown into the trash. She looked up when she saw me and said slowly, "Hello." Her voice was barely audible, weak, as if she could not find the strength to speak. I came closer, but did not sit next to her. The feeling I experienced was a mixture of disgust and pity. "What happened to you?" I asked finally, but she only lowered her head. "I can't. I tried to hide it from you, but it all got out of control." Her voice trembled. She looked up again, and something strange appeared in her eyes. I don't know what came over me. I just wanted to feel alive. I wanted to know what it was like to cheat. I couldn't believe that she was talking about this again. Again, she was returning to the same excuses she had repeated before. I turned away, clenching my fists. The doctor standing behind me was watching the situation without interfering. "It's your own fault for what happened to you," I said finally. I didn't want to continue this conversation. Everything was crystal clear. Her excuses no longer made sense. "You don't understand," she began, but I interrupted her. "No, it's you who don't understand. You ruined everything yourself. And now you're here. And this is your punishment." I left the room without waiting for an answer. I was overwhelmed with emotion, but I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. All I wanted was to end this story. But the next day, I received another call from the hospital. This time they asked me to come urgently. It turned out that her condition had worsened. She barely spoke, refused to eat. I understood that all this was the result of my last visit, and perhaps now she would never return to normal life. I arrived at the hospital, although I didn't want to. The doctor met me in the hall and led me back to the room. I entered her room again, and the picture I saw was even more terrifying than the last time. She was sitting in the corner of the room, hugging her knees and quietly rocking from side to side. Her eyes were clouded, and she barely noticed my presence. "I can't live without you anymore," she finally whispered. I stood there, not knowing what to answer. I felt like a stranger in this situation, but I gathered my strength and left there forever. I remember that day when, sitting in my office, I collected all my wife's things, packed them into boxes, and took them to her sister. There was a cold calculation in my head. Nothing unnecessary, no hatred, no regrets, only the end of what had begun many weeks ago. Farewell to the old life. After that last meeting in the hospital, I never went back. I couldn't. I didn't want to. A few weeks later, I received a message from her sister. It was short, but it made it clear. She doesn't want to give up. I read it and turned off the phone without answering. At that moment, another woman appeared in my life. The one with whom I shared the same pain. The one who had gone through betrayal just like me. Her lover's wife. We met again a couple of weeks after I took my wife to her sister. I didn't expect anything to happen between us, but that night, when we sat down at a table in a small bar, something changed. We talked about what had happened, how our lives had turned upside down, and it felt so strange to share your grief with someone who understood you without words. It was freeing. "How are you holding up?" she asked, looking at me across the table, her hands playing with her glass of wine. "Honestly, I'm tired of feeling things," I said and looked into her eyes. She nodded, understanding me better than anyone. We were both looking for a way out, and this conversation became the beginning of something new for us, although we didn't know then what it would lead to. The next night, I asked her to meet again. This time, I didn't choose a bar or a cafe. I invited her to my place. We sat in my kitchen, swapping stories about how betrayal had ruined our lives. She laughed bitterly, as if she couldn't believe that this was happening to both of us. I laughed with her, but something was still burning inside me. "Do you think they feel guilty?" she asked suddenly. "I don't know," I answered. "Probably not." "Then we should make them feel it." There was more than just pain in her voice. I looked at her, and she smiled, as tired and desperate as I was. It was a turning point, though I didn't know what would happen next. A few more days passed. We started spending more time together. One evening, sitting on the couch, she turned to me and said, "We could start over, right?" These words sounded like a challenge. I felt she was right, but I wasn't sure how far I was willing to go. "We can," I finally answered. The next morning, I received a letter from my wife's lawyer. It turned out that she was going to demand half of our property. Half of the business I had built from scratch, half of everything I had earned. Her lawyer said that she could not live without financial support, especially given her condition after the psychiatric clinic. This was the last straw. I decided to act. That same day, I called her lover's wife. We met at the same bar where it all began. I sat across from her and no longer felt anything but determination. I learned something interesting. I began. She looked at me, alarm flashing in her eyes. "My wife is going to take half of everything I have from me. And your husband still lives with you, right?" She nodded, understanding where I was going with this. "I propose that we team up. If we strike first, we can not only get our lives back, but also make them regret every step they took." Her eyes flashed. She was ready. The plan came together quickly. We decided not only to end the marriages, but also to hit their reputations. She was married to a man who ran his business with no less greed than my ex-partner. Their careers depended on their reputations, and we needed to make sure that all of that collapsed. She gave me information about some of her husband's shady dealings, and I, in turn, collected dirt on my wife. Our forces were equal, and now we had a chance to change everything. The day came when we took action. My first step was to file for divorce, presenting all the evidence of her infidelity. I didn't just want to end the marriage. I wanted to take everything from her. When the trial began, I presented my materials, photographs, recordings of conversations, evidence of her infidelity. Meanwhile, her lover's wife came forward with a statement about her husband's financial machinations. It was a blow to the gut that neither of them expected. Their world began to crumble before their eyes. That evening, we met again. We drank a glass of wine to our success and were silent for a long time, realizing that every step we took was now decisive. 3 months later, both of our marriages were dissolved. We got everything we wanted. Their lives were in tatters, and ours were just beginning to recover. I was no longer the person who doubted or was afraid to act. And that's where today's story ends. If you liked it, don't forget to like it and leave a comment. Your feedback helps the algorithms promote my videos. If this is your first time here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It helps me keep creating new stories for you. Thank you for watching to the end, and see you in the next video.